He had only a few seconds to decide. In the frozen dawn of the Eastern Front in 1943, a German mechanic named Lars Müller stood beside the tank he was ordered to prepare for a suicide assault. Frost covered the steel plates like a thin sheet of white glass. The engine murmured weakly in the cold, its breath drifting into the air like the exhale of a wounded beast. And deep inside the machine, a single metal connector waited for Lars's trembling hands. He knew the mission was doomed. He knew the valley ahead was already marked by enemy guns. And he knew the tank crew, men he worked with and ate with, would not survive the assault. War had demanded many things from him. But today it demanded obedience to an order he could not accept. So Lars made a choice. A small act, hidden in the shadows of the engine bay. He loosened a fuel connector, just enough to disable the tank for a short time. Not enough to cause suspicion, but enough to stop the assault long enough to save lives. His heart pounded as he worked. The cold air bit at his face, but the heat of fear spread across his neck. He knew the price of disobedience. Sabotage meant execution. No trial. No defense. Just a bullet in the snow. Before closing the hatch, Lars placed a small folded message deep behind a gear housing. A warning for the crew. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for them to understand the danger they were about to drive into. Standing beside the tank, Lars felt the weight of his decision settle into his chest. The camp was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made every wrong action echo louder in a soldier's mind. This was the moment that would define him. A single act meant not to harm, but to protect. A rebellion in silence. But war has its own timing. And in seconds, someone would notice something was wrong. Someone would demand answers. And Lars Müller would face the first consequence of his impossible choice. Because behind him, boots were approaching through the snow. The footsteps came closer, slow and heavy against the frozen ground. Lars kept his upper body inside the engine bay, pretending to adjust routine fittings, though his breath fogged the metal with nervous bursts. Every second felt longer than the one before it. He knew how fragile his plan was. One curious glance, one unexpected question, and everything would collapse. The Eastern Front was unnaturally quiet that morning. The kind of silence soldiers feared, still, sharp, expectant. Even the wind moved carefully, dragging thin trails of snow across the vehicles. Then a shadow fell across the open hatch. Corporal Weiss, the tank's young gunner, stood behind him. His cheeks were red from the cold, his eyes lined with fatigue. He asked if the tank was ready. To Lars, the simple question felt like a blade against his neck. He forced a calm answer. "Almost finished," he said. "Just a few checks." Weiss accepted it. He always trusted Lars, the man who had kept their machine alive through storms, breakdowns, and shellfire. That trust tightened something inside Lars, not guilt, but the weight of responsibility. Because today he wasn't repairing their tank. He was weakening it to save them. As Weiss stepped away, Lars paused. There it was again, the faint metallic echo he had heard earlier. A thin clang carried by the wind. Distant, but sharp enough to unsettle him. It wasn't the sound of tools. It felt like a warning. A reminder that nothing stayed hidden forever. He rechecked the sabotage. The connector looked perfect. Too perfect. It would hold for a few minutes once the engine started, then fail cleanly. A stall, nothing more. Enough to force inspection and delay the assault. But danger was closing in. 2 officers were inspecting vehicles down the line, their boots cracking the snow with measured authority. If they reached him before the crew discovered the fault, the entire plan would unravel. Lars slid out of the engine bay, closed the hatch, and forced himself to stand calmly beside the tank. His gloves trembled slightly, maybe from cold, maybe from terror. He touched bolts and panels, pretending to work as the officers approached. Their footsteps grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate, merciless. In a few seconds they would stand in front of him. In a few seconds they would demand a status report. and Lars Muller knew that one wrong word could condemn him. He straightened his back. The officers were almost upon him. Captain Reinhardt stopped beside the tank, his long coat stiff with frost, his expression carved into a cold mask of discipline. Beside him stood Lieutenant Kruger, younger, sharper, and far more dangerous for a man hiding something. Lars felt the air tighten around him as the officers approached. Their presence alone could break a weaker man. Reinhardt placed a gloved hand on the tank's armor, tapping lightly as if listening for secrets hidden beneath the steel. He demanded a status report, calmly, but with an authority that allowed no hesitation. Lars answered with steady words he didn't feel. The tank was warming. Final checks were underway. His voice held, but his pulse hammered violently against his ribs. The captain's eyes lingered on him for a long, unbearable second. Lars felt exposed, as if the man could see through his uniform, through the calm on his face, down into the guilt buried in his chest. But Reinhardt turned away, circling the tank slowly, tapping panels with practiced precision. Kruger crouched near the rear vents, studying the engine compartment with unnerving attention. He was the kind of officer who noticed everything, the kind who found mistakes even when none existed. Lars kept his hands behind his back to hide the slight tremor in his gloves. Every movement Kruger made tightened the pressure in Lars's throat. The sabotage was hidden deep inside the fuel line, invisible unless the officer decided to dig further. 3 seconds more. 5. 10. Then Kruger straightened, dusted frost from his gloves, and stepped back without a word. But just as Lars allowed himself a breath, a metallic echo rang faintly across the camp, the same distant clang he had heard twice before. The officers turned toward the sound with suspicion. The wind carried it again, softer this time, fading like a warning swallowed by the icy air. Reinhardt narrowed his eyes, then looked at Lars as if expecting an explanation. Lars offered none. He stood firm, silent, composed. Finally, the captain issued the order, the crew was to assemble, and the tank would roll within the hour. Then he walked away, leaving deep prints in the snow. Lars exhaled slowly, but the relief was weak, shaky. Because now the danger was greater. The tank would attempt to move far sooner than he had planned. And if the sabotage triggered too early, the officers, not the crew, would discover the fault. And discovery meant death. The officers' departure did not ease Lars's fear, it sharpened it. The order they left behind was the real threat, the tank would move within the hour. That meant the engine would start soon. And once it started, his sabotage would begin counting down like a silent clock hidden beneath the armor. If the failure happened too early, suspicion would fall on him instantly. If it failed too late, the tank might already be moving toward the valley, toward the slaughter he was trying to prevent. He felt trapped between two deaths, one for disobedience, and one for obedience. Snow creaked under approaching footsteps again, but this time they were lighter, more familiar. Sergeant Vogel, the tank commander, appeared with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He was older than the rest, hardened by years of battle, a man who had survived by instinct as much as discipline. He asked Lars if everything was in order. His tone wasn't sharp or suspicious, just practical, calm, the voice of a man used to impossible conditions. Lars nodded, keeping his answer brief. Vogel trusted him completely, and that trust pushed deeper into Lars's conscience. The idea of betraying such a man, betraying his vehicle, his command, tightened something inside him. But this betrayal was the only way to save him. Vogel studied Lars's face for a moment, noticing perhaps the tension in his jaw or the stiffness in his shoulders. Then he placed a hand on the cold armor, as if feeling the tank breathe beneath the frost, and walked away to gather the crew. Lars watched them approach one by one, Weiss the gunner, Braun the driver, the loader, the radio operator. They laughed as they walked, their breath rising in soft clouds. They had no idea the assault was a death sentence. No idea of the artillery waiting across the valley. No idea how close they were to becoming names on a casualty list. Lars forced himself to stay focused. He reviewed the tank's exterior, tightening bolts that didn't need tightening just to mask the tension in his hands. The wind picked up again, carrying snow across the ground in thin white ribbons. Then, there it was. The metallic echo again. Faint. Hollow. Like a distant reminder that something unseen was approaching. He turned, scanning the rows of vehicles, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet the sound lingered in his thoughts, haunting him like a warning he couldn't interpret. The crew climbed inside the tank, preparing to start the engine. Lars stood beside the hull, his breath shallow. Because once that ignition roared to life, the countdown would begin. And his quiet act of rebellion would move one step closer to discovery. The crew settled into their positions inside the tank, their movements echoing softly through the steel hull. Lars remained outside, his gloves pressed against the armor as if trying to feel the machine's pulse before it awakened. He knew the sound that was coming, the heavy cough of the engine struggling in the cold, the deep rumble that followed, the vibration that traveled through the ground itself. And with that sound, the danger would begin. Braun, the driver, called out from inside, announcing he was about to start the engine. Lars stepped back slowly, forcing himself to breathe evenly. His heart felt too loud. Too exposed. The ignition clattered once, twice, then roared to life in a cloud of white smoke. The tank trembled, the vibrations running through its plates like a living creature waking from a deep sleep. Lars watched the smoke rise. It meant the fuel was flowing. It meant the sabotage was now alive. The connector he loosened would hold for a few minutes, long enough to seem accidental when it failed. But he had never tested such a gamble in real combat conditions. He didn't know if the engine's early strain would reveal the flaw too soon. Vogel leaned out of the turret, shouting that the warm-up cycle had begun. He gave Lars a gesture of approval, thanking him for keeping the machine ready despite the freezing weather. That gesture hit Lars harder than any accusation would have. The commander was unknowingly praising the man sabotaging his own tank to save his life. Snow whipped through the air as the wind grew stronger, swirling around the tank treads. Lars listened carefully. Every sound mattered. Every shift in the engine's rhythm meant something. At first, everything seemed normal. The idle was steady. The engine tone was strong enough to fool anyone. But then, a faint uneven knock began, subtle, almost hidden beneath the rumble. Lars felt his stomach twist. The countdown had started faster than he expected. From inside the hull, the crew joked about the cold, about the miserable morning, about how the assault would probably be delayed again. Their voices sounded distant, muffled by steel, and by the fear tightening inside Lars's chest. Then the metallic echo returned. Louder this time. Close. Too close. Lars looked toward the rows of vehicles, but there was nothing unusual. No movement. No tool dropped. No reason for that sound to exist. But it existed. And it arrived every time the tension rose, as if the war itself was warning him that time was running out. He placed a hand on the hull. The vibration had changed. It was only a matter of minutes before the failure happened. And when it did, the eyes of the entire crew, and possibly the officers, would turn directly to him. The engine's uneven rhythm grew clearer, a subtle tremor running through the tank that only a mechanic like Lars would notice. Inside the hull, the crew felt nothing unusual. They continued preparing their stations, adjusting shells, checking radios, tightening straps. For them, the mission was routine. Dangerous, yes. But familiar. They had no idea the machine beneath them was living on borrowed minutes. Lars circled toward the rear of the tank, pretending to observe the exhaust flow. In truth, he needed to stay close. He needed to watch for the exact moment the sabotage revealed itself. The first sign came as a faint hiccup in the engine's breathing. A brief stutter. Soft, but sharp enough to make Lars's pulse spike. Vogel leaned out again, asking if the misfire was normal. Lars shouted back that it was just the cold. Engines always complain in winter, he said. And Vogel believed him, because he always had. The trust in the commander's eyes struck Lars with a painful clarity. These men were not just soldiers. They were human beings who laughed with him, shared bread with him, fixed each other's boots in the snow. And this tank, this machine they treated like a companion, was the only thing protecting them from the brutality of the front. But today, it was the machine he had crippled. The misfire deepened. A stronger knock. A shudder that rippled through the steel plates. The crew felt it now. Braun shouted something about inconsistent throttle response. The loader asked if the fuel lines were freezing. The radio operator cursed the winter. All of them searched for explanations that made sense. None of them imagined sabotage. Lars swallowed hard. The moment was close. Too close. He stepped forward, offering to check the rear intake before they moved. Vogel agreed, thinking nothing of it. Lars opened the hatch with slow, deliberate movements, as if buying seconds he desperately needed. The smell of fuel drifted out, faint but noticeable. The smell told him everything. His sabotage was working exactly as planned. But then, the metallic echo returned again. Loud this time. Near enough that he turned sharply. A sharp clang bouncing across the vehicle rose, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. It was no coincidence anymore. It felt like the world itself was marking each step toward the failure. The commander called down to Braun to prepare for movement. Lars froze. If the tank moved before the failure, the crew could be locked inside a machine that would stall in the open field, visible, exposed, undefended. That scenario was worse than death. He had to make sure the engine failed here, now, before the move order completed. But he had no control anymore. The machine would decide for him. The sound of the failing engine deepened into a long, low groan. And Lars realized he was seconds away from the moment that would expose everything. The engine finally reached its breaking point. A harsh metallic cough burst from deep inside the tank, followed by a violent shudder that rattled the treads. Inside the hull, the crew reacted instantly, voices rising, hands grabbing controls, men bracing for a malfunction they couldn't yet understand. Braun slammed the throttle down, trying to stabilize the engine. Instead, the tank lurched forward a few inches, then froze. The engine growled, choked, and slipped into a rough idle that sounded like a dying heartbeat. Lars felt the vibration run through the ground beneath his boots. This was the moment he had prepared for, the moment the machine would refuse to go any further. But it came faster than he wanted. Too fast. Vogel leaned out of the hatch again, his face tense now. He shouted for an immediate inspection. Braun insisted something was wrong with the fuel pressure. The loader blamed the cold again. The radio operator smacked his equipment in frustration. Confusion spread inside the tank, but confusion was safer than suspicion. Lars approached slowly, forcing a calm expression onto his face even as his chest tightened with fear. If he acted too quickly, they'd question why. If he acted too slowly, the officers might arrive before the truth could be controlled. He opened the engine hatch with deliberate slowness, letting the smell of fuel drift out. A sour, unmistakable scent. The kind that could be blamed on weather, freezing lines, or a cracked seal. Anything except sabotage. Snow blew across the hull as he leaned inside, pretending to check connections he already knew the answer to. He tapped the fuel line with 2 fingers, feeling the vibration pulsing through the metal. The loosened connector was seconds away from slipping entirely. A few more engine cycles and it would detach, forcing a complete stall. That was good. Necessary. But the timing had to look natural. Behind him, Vogel climbed down from the hull. His boots thudded against the snow as he approached. The commander's presence tightened the air around Lars. Vogel trusted him, but trust could turn to suspicion in seconds if anything looked wrong. Lars explained that the cold might have caused a temporary pressure drop. He suggested they shut down the engine for a moment and let him run a deeper check. Vogel hesitated, torn between urgency and caution. Then the metallic echo returned, loud, sudden, sharp. The same haunting clang that had followed every stage of this morning. Both men turned, startled, scanning the camp. No movement. No tools. No reason. Just an empty field of steel and snow. Vogel frowned, uneasy. Lars felt his stomach twist. The echo had become a pattern now, striking at the exact moments of rising tension. As if the unseen hand of fate was marking each step toward the truth. The engine gave one final, violent jerk. A cough. A groan. Then silence. Complete silence. The tank had died. And every eye in the crew turned toward Lars Muller. For a long, fragile moment, no one spoke. The tank sat silent in the snow, steam drifting from its exhaust like fading breath. The crew climbed out one by one, their boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds. All eyes turned to Lars. He could feel their trust shifting, still intact, but strained, fragile, waiting for an explanation only he could give. Vogel stepped forward, his face calm but tight with concern. He asked what had happened. The question wasn't an accusation, but the weight behind it pressed hard against Lars's chest. He leaned into the engine compartment again, pretending to search for the fault. His fingers brushed the loosened connector, the heart of his sabotage. One twist of a wrench would expose everything. One careless movement would reveal the truth. Instead, he guided his hand deliberately, letting the connector slip just enough to look like a natural failure. A frozen seal. A pressure crack. A harmless malfunction caused by the brutal cold. When he pulled his hand back, the connector dangled visibly, hanging loose in a way no trained mechanic would ever allow. Vogel saw it. Weiss saw it. The entire crew saw it. And in that moment, everything changed. The twist of fate revealed itself, not as discovery, but as salvation. Because instead of accusing him, instead of calling sabotage, instead of doubting his skill, the crew reacted exactly as Lars had hoped they would. They blamed the cold. They blamed the winter. They blamed the cheap wartime parts that always cracked when temperatures dropped. Not one of them suspected deliberate tampering. Not one of them questioned his capability. And then came the real twist, the one even Lars had not expected. Braun, the driver, reached into the engine bay and found something tucked behind the gears. A small, folded piece of paper. The warning Lars had left. But the way Braun found it, the timing, the expression on his face as he opened it, it all felt like the world itself had arranged the moment. The note wasn't seen as sabotage. It wasn't seen as a confession. It was seen as foresight. As caution. As the desperate attempt of a mechanic who sensed danger in the engine and tried to alert the crew quietly before a catastrophic failure. Vogel unfolded the note slowly, reading its brief message aloud. A warning about fuel pressure. A suggestion to inspect the connectors carefully before moving. Reasonable. Technical. Helpful. And suddenly, the entire narrative shifted. Lars wasn't the man responsible for the failure. He was the man who predicted it. The man who saved them from driving a fatally damaged tank straight into an assault that would have killed them all. The twist struck him harder than the cold ever could. His sabotage had become an act of competence. His warning had become proof of his loyalty. And in the stunned silence that followed, the metallic echo rang out again, clear, sharp, unmistakable. This time, Lars understood it. It wasn't a warning. It was an omen of survival. The tank was dead. And the crew, unknowingly, had just been saved. The discovery of the note changed everything. The crew gathered closer, forming a tight circle around the open engine bay as Vogel read the words again, slower this time, letting the meaning settle into the cold morning air. A simple warning about pressure fluctuation, a quiet suggestion to double-check the fuel connectors, nothing more. But to men who had already witnessed engines freeze, pipes burst, and seals crack in the unforgiving winter, the message felt like foresight, not sabotage. Lars stood still, uncertain whether to breathe or hide his face. Every instinct told him that silence was safer than speaking. Every heartbeat reminded him how quickly suspicion could return if he misstepped. Weiss placed a hand on his shoulder, thanking him for noticing the issue before it became fatal. Braun joined in, saying the tank could have stalled in the middle of the assault field, where artillery shells carved the earth without mercy. Even the radio operator, who rarely spoke unless complaining, muttered that Lars probably saved their lives without realizing it. Vogel folded the note carefully, almost respectfully, and slipped it into his coat. He told the crew that mechanical failure was a blessing in disguise. They would report the malfunction, request replacement parts, and fall back from the first assault wave until the tank was operational again. That decision carried weight. A tank failing before battle was unfortunate. A tank failing in the middle of a charge was suicide. Lars felt a wave of relief wash through him, but he held it deep inside, hidden beneath layers of practiced calm. The metallic echo returned again, gentle this time, almost soft. Not a warning anymore, but a strange punctuation to the morning's events. He looked around, half expecting some logical explanation, but nothing revealed itself. Only rows of silent machines and drifting snow. The crew began disconnecting equipment and unloading ammunition, preparing the tank for inspection. It would be hours before the mechanics from headquarters arrived. Hours during which no one would question Lars or suspect his role in the failure. Yet inside him, the relief was tangled with something heavier. Guilt was one piece. Fear was another. But there was also something unexpected, a quiet pride. A sense that, for once in this brutal, senseless war, he had acted not as a cog in a machine, but as a human being. He stood beside the tank, watching the men he had saved without their knowledge. Their laughter returned, light but tired, carried by the wind. They didn't know how close they had come to death. They didn't know how deliberate this failure truly was. And they would never know. Because the truth, Lars realized, was a burden he would carry alone. The tank remained silent beside him, a cold monument to the choice he made. And though the crew moved with relief, thinking the worst had passed, Lars could not shake the feeling that another test was approaching, one just as dangerous, but far less predictable. As the crew moved away from the tank to gather tools and report the malfunction, Lars remained beside the silent machine, feeling the cold bite deeper into his gloves. The engine's stillness was unsettling. A dead tank on the front line was more than metal, it was a reminder of how thin the line between life and death had become. Vogel walked toward the command post to inform the officers. The others dispersed across the snow, carrying ammunition crates and fuel hoses, joking about getting a few hours of rest before the next assignment. Lars watched them, knowing their relief came from ignorance, yet grateful for it all the same. For a few brief minutes, he stood alone. That was when the weight of his actions finally settled on him. The choice he made would never appear in any report. No one would write his name in praise or condemnation. His act existed only in the silent space between gears and valves, hidden, fragile, and destined to remain unspoken. The wind cut across the field, lifting small waves of snow and carrying distant rumblings of artillery far beyond the ridge. The war continued, indifferent to one man's moral struggle. And yet the tank beside him felt like a monument to that struggle, a cold witness to a human decision in a world where humanity was in short supply. The metallic echo returned once more, louder than ever. This time it came from somewhere close, too close. Lars turned sharply. The sound bounced between the rows of vehicles, sharp enough to make his pulse jolt. For the first time, he saw someone else react. Weiss stopped walking and looked around, confused. Braun turned his head as well, frowning at the empty snowfield. But no one could locate the source. It was a sound without a face, repeating across the camp like a ghost of steel striking steel. Lars felt a strange shiver crawl up his spine. Whether it was fear or intuition, he couldn't tell. Vogel returned from the command post with a mix of irritation and relief. The officers had accepted the malfunction report without questioning him. The tank would be sidelined until further inspection, and the crew would not participate in the morning assault. That meant they had been spared. The artillery barrage that would have torn through the valley would miss them entirely. The men cheered at the news, some openly, others with tired but grateful smiles. Lars felt the breath he'd been holding escape slowly from his chest. The immediate danger had passed. But inside him, an uncomfortable truth began to surface. Saving their lives had required deception. Hiding the truth had required silence. And surviving the war itself would require more decisions like this, harder ones, perhaps, darker ones. The tank stood still behind him, its broken fuel connector dangling like a quiet secret. And in that moment, Lars understood something he hadn't fully grasped before: this war wasn't testing his skill as a mechanic. It was testing his soul. The hours after the malfunction passed slowly, wrapped in the heavy quiet that followed any disruption on the front. The assault had begun without Vogel's crew, and from the ridge they could hear the distant thunder of artillery swallowing the valley. Every explosion was a reminder of the fate they had narrowly escaped. Some of the men watched from a distance, their faces pale as the smoke rose in dark columns. Others turned away, unable to look at what would have been their final battlefield. Lars stayed beside the tank, pretending to inspect minor components while hiding the tremor in his hands. He listened to the barrage rolling across the frozen earth, each detonation echoing like a delayed heartbeat. The assault was brutal, unrelenting. Even from afar, they could feel the shockwaves pushing through the ground. Vogel joined Lars, standing quietly beside him. The commander didn't speak at first. He simply watched the horizon, the smoke, the flashes of fire lighting the gray sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reflective. He said the failure of their tank had been a blessing. That machines sometimes sensed danger before men did. That perhaps fate had intervened. Lars nodded, grateful for the explanation Vogel offered so willingly, even though he knew the truth lay in his own hands. But the commander wasn't finished. Something in his tone shifted, becoming more cautious. He mentioned the note again. He said it was unusual, thoughtful, almost too timely. Then he asked a question that struck straight into Lars's chest. How did you know something was wrong before the engine even started? The world seemed to narrow into a single thin line. Lars felt the cold tighten around him like a noose. His breath grew shallow, but he kept his posture steady. He answered slowly, carefully. He said he had noticed a faint smell of fuel earlier, a sign of pressure imbalance. A simple technical observation. Believable. True enough not to raise suspicion. Vogel studied him for a long moment, eyes deep with the quiet intuition of a man who had survived too much. The metallic echo struck again, sharp, sudden, cutting through the tension like a blade. Both men turned toward the sound instinctively. But once again, nothing moved. No tools. No figures. Only the endless rows of steel shapes half buried in snow. Vogel exhaled, nodded, and let the matter go. He told Lars to get some rest before the inspection team arrived. The commander walked away, leaving Lars alone with the dead tank, the cold wind, and the truth he had barely managed to hide. The barrage continued across the valley, fading gradually as the assault collapsed into silence. The crew returned to their positions around the tank, weary but alive. And Lars felt the weight inside him shift, not lighter, but settled, like something he would have to carry for the rest of the war. He had saved them. But he had also crossed a line he could never uncross. By the time the inspection team arrived, the battlefield had fallen silent, leaving only drifting smoke and the distant crackle of dying fires. The crew stood beside their disabled tank, exhausted but alive, their faces marked by the weight of what could have been. The mechanics confirmed what Lars had engineered: a loose connector, weakened by the cold, made brittle through long nights on the frozen front. A simple, believable failure. Nothing more. The officers accepted the explanation without suspicion. Paperwork was filed. Replacement parts were ordered. And the tank was officially removed from the assault roster for the next operation. The crew dispersed, some heading for rest, others for food, relieved that fate had spared them once again. Lars remained by the tank after the others had left, running a gloved hand along the cold steel. Beneath that armor lay the secret he had forged in silence, the small act of rebellion that changed the course of the morning. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe fully. His chest loosened. His shoulders lowered. Not because he had avoided punishment, but because he had protected the men who trusted him. In a war built on obedience, he had chosen humanity over orders. He knew the danger would come again. New missions, new assaults, new impossible choices. A mechanic could not change the war. but he could preserve the lives within his reach, one machine at a time. As he stepped back from the tank, the metallic echo sounded once more, clear, solitary, final. Not a warning now. Not an omen. But a strange farewell from the steel beast he had silenced to save its crew. Lars closed the hatch gently, as if saying goodbye to a wounded companion. Snow drifted across the ground, covering the treads in a thin white veil. The frozen wind carried no voices, no artillery, no alarms. Only quiet. A quiet he had created through risk, fear, and a choice that would never be recorded in any military archive. But it didn't need to be. Because the men who laughed beside him that evening, unaware of how close death had come, were all the proof he needed. In a war that consumed lives every hour, Lars Muller had given 4 men one more day on Earth. And that was enough.